Good afternoon. I'm Ángeles Moreno, the outstanding president of EUPRERA, and I want to welcome all of you to the second webinar of the series EUPRERAtalks. We had to produce this webinar as a request from our members who wanted to know how it's going on with the rest of people in EUPRERA, and we thought it was the better way to provide knowledge about what the different network and projects are discussing and producing, and so it's the better way to catch up with everybody in the EUPRERA network. Today we have the second webinar of the series, which is titled Public Affairs and Lobbying, What is Good for? As you know, public affairs and lobbying is one of the growing areas in the profession in many countries. For example, just a week ago, we presented the state of communication in Spain, which is the report that talk about the profession every 5 years. And the area who was expected to grow more in the next 3 years is exactly lobbying and public affairs. I think this is a movement that is happening, especially in many countries in Europe. Many of them are also changing their legislation, so it's a special moment to research and discuss about lobbying and public relations. And you also know, everybody knows, that it has been also one of the most contested and discussed areas in our profession, regarding to the contribution or spoil to the democracy. So this came to the point that we talk about good lobbying or bad lobbying or all lobbying and new lobbying. No, these etiquettes are aware in the last publications, etc. So well, I think it's the moment, there is a very good moment to discuss on these subjects, and we have specialists today to bring the situation of the field. We will have Kelsey Beltz, who is the managing director of the Good Lobby, that is a non-profit startup. Camilla Nothhaft, from University of Lund, who is an recognized member in our community in EUPRERA. We have also Anna Shavit from Charles University in Prague, who will also guest one of our next congresses, the next congress in 2023. And we have Scott Davidson, that is the leader of the Public Affairs and Lobbying Network in EUPRERA. So I think we will have a very, very interesting discussion today, and also a very advanced view of this area of the profession. Thank you very much, all of you, all the guest speakers, to be here today, sharing with us all, your expertise. And I give you the stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Ángeles. I'll just say a few words. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Network on Public Affairs and Lobbying in Europe to, I guess we're the hosts of this webinar. Why this topic? We know PR has a problem, and perhaps even more so for public affairs and lobbying. It's high profile, but treated by many with scorn, some kind of unwelcome presence in our democratic spaces. There are many problems, we don't disagree with that, and as we say in the advert for the webinar, citizens often believe themselves to be powerless and that somehow the lobbying game is rigged in the favour of the already powerful. There's concerns over secrecy or other unethical ways of seeking influence. But I hope it's not a naive statement to say that whilst there is problems, we can also, that practitioners and lobbying practice could actually be part of the solution. And so today we want to discuss what might be good lobbying, what might create more participation, make politics more accountable, make democracies more responsive to the ordinary citizen. And so I'm really pleased that Kelsey is joining us today from the Good Lobby. And Hales has already mentioned, it's a non-profit. It seeks to enhance the advocacy capacity of civic society, whilst making lobbying also more kind of ethical and transparent. Kelsey will tell you more. They do academies. There's already some partnerships with academics, and that's great to see. I'm really interested to hear about that as well. And then, so when Kelsey's finished, myself, Anna, and Camilla will just make some comments ourselves, and we're of course completely open to all our attendees and anything that you want to talk about in response to what Kelsey has said or the issue. Please say anything. This is open and informal. And I will say that, of course, Camilla, has, of course, worked in public affairs consultancy and spent many years observing lobbyists at work in Brussels. Anna has worked as a political consultant and writes and specializes in public affairs and lobbying. I used to work in public affairs management myself, campaigns management for large charities and health organizations, and I'm very interested in this topic. So enough of that introduction. If I could hand over to you, Kelsey. I think you've got some slides that you wanted to present as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll start sharing my screen. But thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I was very happy to be invited to speak here today. I think we've already touched a little bit even on my first point, which is the idea of, what is a good lobby? As was mentioned, we are an NGO. We are not professional lobbyists, but we chose this name very strategically, understanding that there would probably be, shall we say, some connotations that come with it. Because the second that you say lobby, people immediately tend to say, oh my gosh, that's really bad. There's all this power. So even as an NGO, sometimes we walk into the room and they say, oh, you're the lobbyist. And I say, no, actually, I'm not a lobbyist professionally. I work for an NGO, but we chose it deliberately. And the reason that we chose the good lobby is really all sort of encapsulated in this quote, which is that we think that to have a good, solid public debate, to have a real space where you're debating democratic issues, we need all parties to be heard. So I think there's often this sort of connotation that there's too much lobbying, there's too much special influence, there's too many people sort of whispering in the ears of others. But the idea of having the good lobby was not necessarily to detract from that public dialogue, but it was very much to say, it's not that there's too much lobbying, it's that it's not necessarily being done equally. There's different interests who are being represented more than others. And so at the crux was the idea that we actually can use lobbying for good, and we should all be essentially lobbying. But the most important part is we need to sort of democratize it. So this is sort of our core ethos. And then how we do it, as also mentioned by Scott, is we have several pillars. So we really help NGOs, in particular activists, also some progressive businesses, through a combination of strategic advice, which could be people coming to us and asking for help in terms of a stakeholder mapping or in some way to help them sort of enter the policy process. A lot of trainings. So I myself, I've trained probably hundreds and hundreds of advocates, from small NGOs to well-known NGOs like WWF, training grantees of philanthropies, sometimes training businesses. And then one thing we really want to emphasize is this sort of unconventional alliances, which is the idea that what we really try to do is to bring people together and understanding how they can work either between sectors, between countries, trying to really sort of understand the way that we can work together, because one of the most powerful ways to actually sort of balance the special interest is actually to be working with people that you might not have necessarily thought of. So this is us sort of in a nutshell. But don't worry, because I'm going to unpack, I guess, quite quickly. This is not a university lecture, so I won't keep you here for 30 minutes. It's just a very sort of brief, what I would say, intro to our mentality as Good Lobby. And then I'll open the floor to my colleagues to sort of give their thoughts, and we will also welcome any and all questions. So bear with me for just a few more minutes. So this is sort of what I would say when you say you're a lobbyist. This is kind of the image people have, right? It's this idea, whether I'm American by nature. I've been in Europe now for 7.5 years, but of course, there's a connotation that comes with lobbying. So you think often of groups like this. You think of Shell, you think of Amazon, Coca-Cola, who have sort of all this money, and they're really the ones pulling the strings. They're kind of the puppet masters, so to speak, of this political process. And then we tend to think of citizens, if you look down at the lower right portion, as being much smaller, as not necessarily being able to stand up to this corporate interest. And that's part of what motivated us, really. So our founder and director, Alberto Alemano, founded the Good Lobby in 2015 to basically do exactly this, which is the idea that we need to be able to balance out this sort of scary, money-heavy corporate interest with citizens who should be equally engaged and equally listened to in the policy process. So he wrote a book called Lobbying for Change, which is exactly this. It's basically it's 10 steps to give tools to citizens to use essentially the same tools that professional lobbyists use, but to be able to actually use them for their own causes and to make their voices heard. So it can go from something very basic if you've never lobbied in your life, or we use the same methodology with groups like WWF, who of course are quite well known in the lobbying field, but the steps remain the same. So it's really kind of a very, very good how-to guide in terms of sort of how to start with your lobbying. And then what we like to say, because there's all of these sort of loaded connotations, of course, so there's this idea that lobbying is this really ephemeral concept, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much as defined here. It's just that you're trying to persuade an authority figure, normally a politician, to support laws that give either your cause or your industry an advantage. So part of the reason we have this negative connotation is because we think of things like big tobacco, big pharma. So it seems like they're supporting, their industry might not necessarily be the industry that serves our interests as citizens. But you as a citizen can also persuade people to support your own interest, to support your interest in conserving biodiversity, or to support your interest in welcoming refugees. It's the interests that matter, and it's the way that you persuade people. It's not the act itself. Lobbying is really just persuasion. And then why do you work on lobbying, right? So this is really our core philosophy. And so why did we choose lobbying when we could have been doing various other things? So as I said, the idea is that it's a legitimizer. It can take your cause, and it's not just allowed, but it's encouraged. Increasingly, even the OECD has said that lobbying is an essential part of our democracies. So it's one of these things that actually legitimizes your discussions with politicians. And it's not just something that's legal or sort of a back alley tactic where you're ambushing a politician. It's actually something that's encouraged. It's a dialogue. It's a form of dialogue with your politicians that really should be used much, much more than it is. It's a mobilizer. So I think all of us are quite familiar with this sort of, as we call it in English, slacktivism, which is the idea that I'm sure we've all seen on social media. People share a petition, or maybe they just share a post. They have just a black box as their social media photo. It's a way of feeling engaged, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really move the needle, right? Those sort of commodified posts are not actually going to get the attention of politicians. They're much more just for the sort of serotonin of doing that and then sort of moving on. Whereas lobbying, with a sort of concrete policy goal, can take those ambitions. It can take these causes that you might care very much about, but it'll take them off of social media. It'll actually make it something that's in some ways more on the political arena. So it's a way to mobilize meaningfully for the types of change that we don't always know how to mobilize for. An equalizer, as I already said, sort of with the first picture, I mean, when you think about the big lobbyists and you think about the, sort of the amount of power and money that's resting in these political systems, we absolutely need citizens, we need NGOs, we need these other parties to be countering that influence. We need them to be also part of the political dialogue, we need them to be part of the discussions, and we need their voices to be heard. But without lobbying, if it's just protests or if it's just other types, you're not necessarily on the same footing. So what you really need is to be using these same tools with a direct political hook to be having any of the same results as these big businesses. It's more than just awareness raising. It's taking the awareness raising and actually giving it a platform to directly engage with politicians for concrete policy change. And then, yes, this is somewhat controversial, so I'll be very happy to hear the insights of my colleagues and also to hear some of the feedback from the chat. But of course, you know, many of us think, of course, business is overrepresented, right? There's too much money, it's all big tobacco, it's all big pharma, it's Coca-Cola, it's plastic. But what we argue is not actually that business is overrepresented, but that civil society is underrepresented. We need more political dialogue. We're never trying necessarily to curtail the voices of people who are influencing politics. What we do try to do, and I'll get to this a tiny bit later, is to make sure it's transparent and ethical. You want to know who's saying what and to who. But the idea is not necessarily to have less political influence. The idea is that all actors would be represented. It's democratized. And then it's done in an ethical and a transparent way so that we as citizens can see exactly what's happening, have the full picture, and then we can make sort of our decisions based on that. So not less lobbying, but more lobbying. So I am curious to hear the reactions to that. I'll just finish very quickly these slides before I open up to questions, and then then we'll have plenty of time. Yes, lobbying makes you humbler. I think lots of us are sort of, in English, we say backseat drivers when you're giving the driver advice. We might be backseat advocates, where it seems very easy to tell the politicians exactly what to do. But when you actually enter the process, you really realize there's a lot of trade-offs, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of back and forth, so it can make it easier to understand exactly why your policy goals don't get passed every time. It's not just about money, it's actually that the political process is a majorly complicated series of trade-offs. And so it's actually good to have that firsthand experience. And you might get knocked down a few times. You probably won't achieve your very first goal, but it's a real learning experience that ends up benefiting you in the long run. And then finally, yes, I mean, it's good for democracy. It's a way to keep in contact with your politicians. It's a way to keep them accountable. It's a way to have your voice heard. It's a way to have this sort of pluralistic dialogue that makes things more accountable. We need to be listening to citizens. We need to have avenues for which those citizens can participate. That's the only way we're going to have a democracy that's not necessarily top down. It has to be continuously bottom up, which requires mechanisms to participate. And yes, final thing is, lots of us think, okay, so I hope that everyone votes in elections. I think we know from data that not everyone does, but the idea is sometimes people go vote and they say, okay, I did my democratic duty. I voted, now I have this representative and they're going to represent my interests. But those are just between elections. So if you're in France, it's every 5 years. If you're in America, it's every 4 years and you have midterms. I mean, that's a very long time to not necessarily be directly engaging in politics, because politics is happening between elections. It's happening all of the things that happens in between elections and all of the things that actually influence the laws, that influence the agenda. You should be in regular contact, because it's not just that you have a vote every 5 years and everything's solved. So it's really a mechanism between elections to keep democracy participative, because this is really just the baseline and you need to be constantly monitoring, constantly in dialogue with your politicians in between. And then final slide, because we're also going to I think some of my colleagues will hit on the idea of also regulation and transparency. So a lot of what we do with the Good Lobby is this sort of what I've mentioned, this equalizing access to power. So the trainings and the helping people have resources, matching people with legal experts, that's sort of the bottom up. And that's a big part of what we do. But what we also do is we try to shape the lobbying environment itself. So to have more regulation, more transparency, because it's really only with these two sort of complementary angles that we're going to have a democratic and inclusive Europe, or a democratic and inclusive society anywhere you live. We want to give people more access to power, but then we also work on things like sustainable corporate governance, the transparency register. We worked on the whistleblower directive. So we're trying to do both at the same time, which is really help more people have access, but also make sure the environment that they're accessing is conducive to this type of sort of transparent, ethical lobbying. And that was a lot. So I think with that, I will probably stop sharing. I don't know if we want to open the floor to questions first, or if we can go straight to comments.
Thank you, Kelsey. That's really good. Well, I think we're flexible. We can. We're checking the chat box or the Q&A box. I haven't seen any questions come in just yet. I mean, somebody wanted to ask a question about the Good Lobby. They could do now, but myself or Anna and Camilla could start us off, and then we can see, and then open the floor perhaps at that point. I'm just checking. So No, I've got no questions. So
I could start
Camilla
with
or
a
Anna
question
wants to
if you
come in
want.
now. Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
please. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. It was really very interesting to hear how you are working and this very structured work to enhance transparency, which we are discussing in this group, of course. How can we do to enhance transparency in lobbying, and how can it be regulated, and how can it work, and so on. I have done participatory observations myself, and when I observe the lobbyists and the politicians, I see that great part of the work is not only lobbying, it's collecting intelligence. So a lot of time, and they do it under the cover of lobbying, because to do lobbying is somehow the way to get access to the decision makers. But in reality, they want to gather intelligence. How do you deal with that in the education? I'm curious, exactly now, how do you deal with it? How do you work with it? Because I'm not perfect up to date how the systems look now in, for example, in Brussels, with how you gather intelligence and so on. How do you deal with it in the education?
It's a very good question, and it's a very good point. So when we do go through our sort of methodology, the very first thing we say, I think a lot of people tend to pick their cause and then they go straight into their lobbying plan. And we always say, slow down. First thing you do is a nice stakeholder map. I never stop saying it. And then you do a legislative review. Because if you go to your lobbying plan without either of those two things, you're going to be completely adrift. So doing your homework is the most important. But it's true that a lot of people, you know, a professional lobbyist will have different access to resources than an individual. So one thing we do suggest a lot for in our educational activities, and it's one thing that the Good Lobby offers, is we have a pro bono matchmaking network. So we have 9 law firms who work exclusively with us, and they offer their legal services for free. We have 2 public affairs firms. And so if you have a really technical issue, we always say it's best to consult an expert, because someone who's basically in the Brussels scene is going to be able to do a legislative review in 5 hours that will take you 2.5 months. So there's always a good moment to consult an expert. But it's also, the good news about EU politics is so much information is online. It's actually much more transparent in many ways than national governments in terms of access. You can access meeting minutes. You can see who's meeting with who. They're regularly publishing consultations. So I think you could do a first desk review as a citizen, just knowing your issue and really diving into the institutional websites. There's also websites like Ask the EU, which can help you get documents. There's websites like Integrity Watch, where you can literally see who's meeting with who in the minutes and what they're meeting about. So I'd say that's a good first review. And then if you're working on something super technical, there's a ton of resources out there, including Good Lobby, which I can share in a follow-up that can link you with a professional who probably already has the answers, and then it saves you resources and a headache.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. You know, there's 2 things I noted, Kelsey, which I really liked. I really liked on your presentation the phrase "don't allow, encourage." I really like that spirit, and I like the phrase of going beyond serotonin as well, which I think is because when people tend to think of participation often as this kind of symbolic, make yourself feel good kind of things, and I think influence and lobbying is actually hard work, and it's another reason why it's in a way it's unequal, is that you have to keep turning up every week, every month, every year. That's how you get influence, and often citizen kind of initiatives often kind of just temporary. They kind of bubble up and then they disappear, and it's building capacity to be there all the time and to be in those corridors or virtual corridors, or having those coffee meetings I know that Camilla wrote about, you know, and having those opportunities to engage and network. Yeah, and breaking the horizon scanning and intelligence advantage, I think that's something that is not easy, but I think that's one of the solutions. Is, you know, yeah, even myself sometimes in things I've done, it's really hard to find sometimes what's the policy situation. I want to send something to a civil servant. Who's a civil servant? What department's actually responsible for this little bit of policy? Really, really hard on the outside. If Google is your research tool and you have nothing else, it's very, very hard to get involved in that. So I've been very interested in maybe making transparency more radical, so it creates data, and then civil society can use that data. We could create applications, software. We could mobilize, around that data, and or transfer resources. The EU does this a little bit. It puts money into civic society kind of forums, doesn't it? So to encourage kind of lobbying. And I guess on the practitioner side would be responsible lobbying. To maybe make it change the culture to have a better alignment between, social responsibility principles and environmental commitments. And we know often businesses make commitments on one day, but in private they're lobbying against the things they publicly said they would support. And I think maybe that's where I'm thinking practitioners, why can practitioners themselves obviously be more influential? There's just a couple of thoughts I had, but I'm interested in the academic links as well. But yeah, I don't know if Kelsey wants to come back or Anna come in at this point. I think.
Sorry, I'll let Anna go and then I'll respond.
Yeah.
We also have a great question in the Q&As, but I really liked what Kelsey mentioned also about the transparency and that no civil societies is that the civil society is basically underrepresented. And this is also very refreshing because if you look in like what I do, my field is political marketing and campaigning. And of course, big part of this research is political lobbying or how the NGOs are involved. But very rarely you came across actually explaining and understanding that lobbying can be a very useful, even necessary tool. And if people think differently, that's completely wrong. And so it's also more the question about how to go about the transparency about how the things are regulated and what does it bring in and who actually is lobbyist and who is not. These are also the very, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to distinguish. And we have currently, I'm coming from the Czech Republic, we have currently a lot of interesting example, also how many NGOs, but also surprisingly, many lobbying companies are, for instance, very much helping Ukraine cause and organizing a lot of campaigns for raising money and doing many other activities. But lobbying still has a really bad name and bad connotation in the country. So what you're doing in your NGO is actually very useful and in many ways fantastic. And but maybe we should address the Q&A, which goes a little bit deeper exactly into this from Nadine Strauss.
I cannot see the Q&A, so if someone would be okay to read it to me, that would be amazing.
Okay, it's maybe actually Nadine could even talk. Yes. I understood it.
So
no, I can see it. Now I do see it. Okay.
Can you see it or not?
No, sorry, I wasn't used to the webinars. Now I do see it. Okay, so what real success? I was looking in the chat. So what real success factors, are influencing? Yeah, that's a good question. So what are real success factors? So I think I said what my first response would be, which is of doing your homework. And people, like I said, they tend to sort of skip that step because it's not as fun, but all of the rest of the success of your lobbying plan is going to depend on how good your stakeholder map is. Not just stakeholders who are interested necessarily who are supporters, but people who are against your cause, people who could potentially help you. Cross-sectoral, don't only map NGOs, don't only map businesses. You really want to have the most beautiful stakeholder map possible. And then I think that Professor Davidson hinted at this, but the policy cycle and all of these things change so quickly. So you should be constantly revisiting your stakeholder map. It shouldn't be something that you do and then a year later you go look at it. I mean, you should be looking at how those sort of dots move. In terms of persuasive techniques, I think we work a lot on sort of, depending on what your sector is, but hitting the balance between having really well thought out sort of data points and the sort of emotional component. I think with some NGOs, for instance, we work a lot with climate NGOs. And I have one in particular who they have so much data and, data that they think because they're in it, you should just present the data to the politician and they should just fall over backwards and support your cause because there's just, the facts are all there, but that's actually not really what works. And if you sort of data bomb people, so to speak, they're going to shut down and they're not going to be processing it. So things like fact sheets that really in simple terms list the most important points from your data can be super effective. Similarly, I work with groups working on anti-human trafficking. So in some ways, it's almost the opposite. You know, who could go to a meeting and when you're talking about children being trafficked and, you know, walk out of that meeting and not support your cause? But at the same time, you have to balance that, and you have to have what I would say a hook to bring the politician onto your cause. So that's where your homework can be quite helpful, because politicians are part of a broader agenda, right? See what their goals are for that political cycle, see who their allies are, see who they're making trades with, because all of those things are going to influence your success. It's not just that they pick things because of the data or the emotion, it's part of a broader ecosystem, and all of those things are going to come into play. So while persuasion and personal connections are important, I would say the most important is thinking about politics as a system. Think about when you're going, when is the vote? Don't go to the commission if it's already in parliament and the council. You know, just all of those things that sometimes people don't think about, I would say. So having this holistic view would be the most important. That probably sounds sort of scary, which is, you can look on our website and see how we break down the steps, but I think people sometimes they get tunnel vision and they forget about the broader system, and that can actually be quite counterproductive. I don't know if either of you, Camilla, would like to respond.
I can add a little bit if you want to your great advice, Kelsey, which I think would work as a charm. I think what Scott said before is very important too. If I give the academic point of view on effective lobbying, that it's a long-term engagement. You have to be there and really know all these little details, what people think and so on. So this is really long-term engagement work. If one go into more detailed perspective, more on a micro perspective, where I do my research, I feel that going back concretely to Nadine's question, success factors in persuasion never make the politician feel pressed. You always have to give information to the politicians so the politician feel that they have the upper hand, that they are never pressed or forced to think something. They came up with a good solution, really. In fact, that's how my research says. Another thing that I read from literature that is just very plain consequence analysis. What are the consequences and how big are the consequences? The politicians love to see consequence analysis and to have these stories. What will happen if we do this? What will happen if we do that? The long effects, the big effects, but also the little stories about everyday life. How does this impact a certain chemics? My mother as a gardener in England, how does this impact here? They love to hear stories all the time, to hear these concrete stories, because they can retell these stories when they go into commission meetings and so on. So these are the things that are easy to retell. It's very difficult to retell facts and a fact sheet and numbers, but a story is easier to retell. So that's what I have seen in my research regarding Nadine's question.
Thank you. I think that was a super good point, especially about not feeling pressed. And I think that's part of where the fact sheets and things can come in. You present them with the information and the consequences, absolutely, but you let them come to their own conclusion.
Huge resource issues, though. As I say, this is part of the long-term challenge to the skill of storytelling, or even stakeholder mapping, because a lot of knowledge transfer. And I wonder sometimes whether, just a quick, and not really a question for you, but this pro bono culture that you have in law doesn't seem to exist in public relations and public affairs so much. Maybe I'm missing something, but that would be a nice change from within the profession to, to have a culture within agencies or in-house departments, so, where you just, for no particular, obvious benefit, you go and transfer knowledge and work on kind of, civic projects. It would be really nice. I'm going to, nothing from Nadine. If anyone wants to speak, please let me know. We don't have to do it all by text. We could go to Connor. Good to see Connor here. Always like listening to Connor. He's got some good questions, and not just because he's actually said something very nice about one of my articles, but excellent stuff. Thank you. So Connor's got a question. So he said enjoyed the presentation. He's read the book as well, so that's excellent stuff. But you might better see it, Kelsey. So he says, but part of lobbying is being more transparent, and if people have to be open in acknowledging that they are professional lobbyists, as the good lobby advocates directly to policymakers for increased regulation, should you accept that you are also a lobbyist? There you go.
No, it's a very good question. And I mean, it comes up a lot and you're pointing at the right thing. So indeed, we do advocate for certain interests. I think one of the ways that we differentiate slightly is that we're not advocating for interests other than our own. So often when we're advocating for increased regulation, it's either Alberto in the context of an HEC professor. We very rarely are lobbying on behalf of a client, if never. But it's true, we are influencing, and using the definition that I already gave you, we are indeed influencing. So one of the ways that we have mitigated that, that I suggest everyone does if you're an NGO, is the transparency register. So on an annual basis, we update all of our EU grants, we update our major clients and people of which we're in network with to the transparency register. And then you get a number. And so anyone who's trying to work with us or is interested in our work can just simply look at our transparency register entry and can see exactly what type of work we're doing, notably at the EU level. So that, I think that's one way to say, okay, so yes, we're involved in sustainable corporate governance. We're involved on regulation, but you can see exactly which EU grants we're a part of. You can see exactly those types of clients. So it helps, at least from a transparency perspective, see sort of who we're working with. And yes, we are an NGO, but indeed we influence policy, mostly on our own behalf would be my differential. But I highly recommend transparency registries for everyone, because I think it's a really nice way to see exactly who's doing what.
Kelsey. I've got the Zoom controls here. I have the authority. I can allow people to talk. So I don't know if Connor wants to come in at all, or you can just send a message if he wants to come back at all. Yeah, okay. Let's see if I can let's see if this works. Allow to talk. Connor, can you see? I think you've been added now.
Can you hear me, Scott?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks very much. I mean, it was a really interesting presentation, and I've had a look at your website, and I mean, you're really doing terrific work. There's no doubt about it. But every NGO is essentially advocating its own interests rather than on behalf of a client. And yet, if the good lobbyists are reluctant to use the word lobbyist to describe themselves, and the bad lobbyists don't want to use lobbying to describe themselves, then inevitably, every time the public think about lobbying, they don't have positive examples to see. Part of the problem, I think, is that in every country, all of us are represented by organizations. If we're a member of a trade union, if we're a member of a professional body, if we're a member of a church, if we get a pension, if we're a Boy Scout, if we're a postman, everybody has lobbyists working for them, but we don't connect that with our daily lives. And partly, I believe, that's because everybody, whether they're doing it for good or for less good, shies away from describing themselves as lobbyists. And to me, I think professional lobbyists have to kind of reclaim that word and take it away from, the only time you see it is in newspaper headlines and media scandals, and the industry won't start to put itself on a better footing in terms of public opinion until lobbyists begin to acknowledge that they are lobbyists, I think.
Thank you so much, Connor. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, it's why we chose the name The Good Lobby, citizen lobbyists. It's very much infused in our language. I think one of the differentiating factors, specifically in terms of registration, is because we're an NGO, we don't represent clients for profit. So that's one of the reasons that, like, for instance, we're not registered as a lobbyist. But I totally agree. And I know we've tried a little bit to destigmatize the term even with our own language, but yes, we could probably take it one step further. There's just a slight differentiation in terms of, like, yes, exactly what our role is within the professional field. But yes, I think we should probably all be more proud to be lobbyists, whether it's officially registered or not.
Anna?
If I may just add on it, because technically, if you will look at the Czech Republic, you could say that lobbying doesn't exist here. We don't have any regulation, we don't have any law, And everyone who is actual lobbyist calls himself or herself a public affairs expert or strategic advisor or anything else. So you will literally find nobody with a business card saying lobbyist, because this automatically means you are really evil person. And we even have association of public affairs agencies, which openly say we are doing lobbying, they're being transparent about it, but they would call it public affairs. And the debate is basically stuck. There is no way it will change anytime soon. And funnily enough, when there was a chance to have a law inspired by the Canadian one and many others to regulate the profession, which the professionals wanted, it was refused by politicians. And this debate goes back 15 years ago. And last conferences about lobbying were 5 years ago. So this is like a non-goal, but it evolved into being an expert advisor, strategic communicator. So of course we do have lobbyists, but nobody's gonna reclaim anything here. You know, there are even diploma thesis and dissertation analyzing this phenomenon, which I know it's not that unusual to other countries. But we also have NGOs. Nobody's doing anything like remotely close to what you do. But there's a lot of NGOs who are lobbying for various issues, and they can even be collaborating with political parties. But it's usually for like a good cause. But it's really, I think you're doing great work also because of that, and bring in a clarity and transparency. And I would even dare to say that this is a very positive impact of American democracy, what you bring in here, which is a little bit different than what we are used to do in Europe. You know, we are much more secretive about everything. So this is very cool. I'm done.
No, thank you. I'm laughing. It wasn't me as the American who introduced this by any means. Alberto is very European, but it is true. I mean, I've brought my lens of growing up with American lobbying and sort of seeing the differences, but no, thank you. And I agree. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think everyone raised good points about how we should be phrasing our lobbying.
There's, I can't remember this exactly, but Eleanor Melgin was once telling me she was used to be head of the professional communicators like association in Finland, and they organised an event in Helsinki where they all had T-shirts. And it said lobbyist, and it had, I can't remember exactly the other phrase. It's like 3 hugs or get a hug from a lobbyist or something. Can you remember?
I remember.
Yeah.
It said, "Hug me, I'm a lobbyist."
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. It's extremely funny. She told me that exactly, probably the same conference as you, Scott, because it was the same time I came from Brussels and I had attended a meeting with young lobbyists who were in despair because of exactly this, as Conor says, that they didn't feel respected, that they didn't feel listened to, because they were both lobbyists and they were young. They were dreaming of walking around with a badge where it says, "I'm a lobbyist and I'm proud." That was their suggestion. I haven't seen whether they did.
Thank you. I remember that correctly. And I remember that it was part of, it was actually part, so they're, they're representing practitioners and they're trying to explain the kind of more, the legitimate and positive roles that lobbyists play, and they had a nice idea to do so. So, I mean, certainly, I don't think it's not quite our role as academics, but maybe the professional associations, need to be a bit more open and out there, to use the word lobbyist and to explain it a bit more. Yeah, and they should wear T-shirts and offer people hugs. It's a great stunt, and more people should do it. Yeah,
I think you would have mixed results in Brussels, but I guess 2 out of 3 could be a hug, and the third be a humbling experience. But
yeah, so.
But if I may, sorry, it's also I read the very interesting chat what we could do for the lobbying itself, but that's going back to the transparency, because there are issues you can't really openly debate, which is, for instance, buying or selling weapons and doing this or that, or lobbying for this and that cause. So it's still like we can idealize it, but I think without a clear regulation and definition, we can't really move around. There could be really good causes you're lobbying for, which public will understand, and they will be very happy about it, but there is still so many things you actually have to do some lobbying for, and they're not gonna be perceived positively or happily or openly. And another thing is how you will, so much work is also done with the legislation, and public will be never really interesting in, you know, like this amendments, this and that and that and that. So it's, maybe there's a good start with some positive cause, but generally it's a very complex profession, and maybe we should not forget about that also. I'm here contradicting a little bit what I said before.
No, I agree. Scott, if you don't mind, I wanted to circle back to a point that I think relates to what you just said, and also something that Scott mentioned, which is that really there's this, as I think you mentioned, this misalignment, which is something we're working on a lot at the Good Lobby. So the idea that a company might be openly very green, very sustainable, or very pro-LGBTQ rights, and then behind the scenes, they have this political spending or this political influence that's directly contradicting what they've been basically saying for their CSR. So this is one thing that at the Good Lobby, in a dream world, like what we would actually like to see is the way that we sort of have these environmental standards or ESG standards with social responsibilities. We'd really like to see a political standard where you would be forced to disclose your political influence. I think there's already some transparency in terms of direct spending, but all of these other sort of less formal ways of influence that are equally powerful when it comes to a lobbying sphere, and that also put these companies in this misalignment. I think we would really push for this idea of, yeah, political responsibility, not just environmental, not just social, because as you've said, I mean, it can be quite hypocritical in terms of, you know, it's hard to know exactly what a company is doing, even with transparency reporting standards. It's not always clear. So one thing, our founder Alberto was at Davos last night, and this was his big sort of pitch, was the idea that we need this political responsibility. We need to know about these more subtle forms of influence, exactly what these groups are doing, and kind of combat this misalignment, because otherwise, yes, lobbying is always going to be looked at as bad. It's always going to seem like even very green companies are not necessarily living up to their standards. So our hope would be going beyond just transparency reporting to figure out a way to sort of measure this political impact and this lobbying impact, and have that also be part of the public record. Ambitious though it may be.
Yeah, that's it's interesting. I think that's a long-term initiative, and I've started to see people speak about this before. I picked up some ideas about responsible lobbying, and there's been a kind of UN kind of document produced about this a long time ago, about this alignment between your kind of social responsibility or your and what you actually do. And I think there's probably a role for academics there, which would be nice, I think, in terms of helping them discover themselves and finding the pathways forward. So I'm conscious of time. I think it's a really nice conversation started to develop in the chat box as well about say it loud, say it proud, you know, I'm a lobbyist. And Connor, I think it's asked, but I think the professional associations, in a way, who are not here in this discussion have a role there, I think, absolutely. Yeah. I've got one question, actually, just talking point, and I can see one from Haley's as well, so which are in slightly different directions. And Haley's is asking about if the profile of the lobbyist is changing in Europe. That's interesting. If you wanted to say more, Haley's to explain that, I guess. I don't know if it's changing, if you mean in the popular image of lobbyist, or whether in professionally, maybe. My instinct is that professionally, they like to use the term public affairs more, because that's an indication of professionalization. And in some way, it's a profession and it's more respectable than the term lobbyist, which I guess connects to this discussion we've just had. I'm not sure if I don't know if anybody else has any views on this, but my question would be, I don't want to put you on the center, Kelsey. You just, you know, it's a panel rather than just like ask. But what would the role? How can we connect as academics, though? Because this is an audience mostly of academics, and I wonder what people think, or what you think about how, you know, academics can connect with practitioners or NGOs like yourself, and how we might work together.
I mean, it's a good question, and I mean, one really has to remember that at the core, Alberto is an academic. I mean, he's done all of this political work, but he's head of EU law at HEC. He's constantly guest lecturing. I mean, the reason that he's sort of emerged into this political sphere is because of his own research and sort of seeing this gap to fill. The Good Lobby was actually born out of a law clinic, because the law clinic at NYU Paris, where I used to work, was going so well. We said, why don't we sort of institutionalize this? I think that so there's obviously a role to play in terms of academics in some ways doing the heavy lifting and, you know, monitoring how much data is out there, monitoring the different transparency things. But this is, so I think there's this role and there's an increasing number of people who are interested in lobbying, which is great. I think it comes down then to circling back to the question of how to best influence politicians, which, as I said, is not to, you know, slam a dissertation onto their desk and walk away. So I think in terms of having really wonderful data and monitoring some of these phenomenon, and in some ways taking it a little bit further, things like again, like a lobbying footprint, that's amazing. And then I would say figuring out the best way to package that to something that's palatable for a politician, which would most likely involve, as I said, a coalition. So, you know, maybe you would have some of the data points, but you would partner with someone who had more of the connections, and then an NGO that was perhaps interested, would be the most effective. I mean, but there's definitely a role for academics, and in some ways it's sort of the core of a lot of this, because professional lobbyists aren't monitoring their own work necessarily. So I think there's a huge role for it. It depends on the packaging, because it depends how you can present it in a way that gets policymakers' attention, rather than it just being another sort of research paper that's written about them, but they don't, you know, it doesn't make too much of a splash. I don't know if Camilla and Anna want to. No, not so much. Okay. Nadine.
Sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just so I'm obviously in the spirit of, you know, participation, and if, as we and I'm trying to see if there's any attendees here. If anybody who hasn't participated yet, Nadine. You have a hand up, Nadine. I'm going to allow you to speak, Nadine. Coming. I wanted to see.
Yes,
sorry. Spoken yet. Hi, Nadine.
I could turn on my voice. Thank you again for the presentation. We recently have conducted also a media analysis of the impact of NGOs on media portrayal of the COP26 coverage. And I was wondering if you also from practice could say a little bit more about the role of the news media to really get the movement going, maybe to raise your voice and raise attention for certain issues. Is this something that you're also working on, or what's your take on that?
I don't know if Anna or Camilla, you want to respond? I feel like I'm monopolizing a bit.
I honestly don't really know how to address that. I would like to see the analysis. But just like, I really don't know what to add to it, to be honest, at this moment, without seeing it. So.
No, I just mean in general, because our analysis was actually commissioned by an NGO in the UK, and we had their messaging, and we tried to see to what extent these messages were taken over by certain news media. And so apparently they use it to also kind of get an indication of how successful they were in their media relations work. And I was just wondering if there's something that what you work on in practice as well.
So if I understand it correctly, by seeing the effect of the messages and measuring it, you could explain, or they use it for explaining the success of the campaign.
Yeah.
Or of the effort.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's super interesting, because usually this is the most difficult, how to prove that something has any output or effect. So this is actually a very great approach. Like my personal experience is very much related to the elections, and then you see the results, but we do pay, even in the political campaigning, you pay a huge, like a lot of energy is actually consumed by proper messaging. And this is one of the things which is most tested, what would work. And you do various polls and other things and analysis to see how the message will be perceived with what group. So here I think this can be actually pretty well used. And it's very interesting way how to go about it also with lobbying. And it's a little bit unusual in my personal experience, but it's a big part of political campaigning, like messaging and targeting and groups. So this is what I can add also out of experience, but I don't know if it's exactly fitting to your comment.
I'm not sure either. I haven't researched or asked lobbyists or politicians how they view the news media and sovereign relation. The only thing I've read other researchers who have researched campaigns where organizations that lobby suddenly do a news campaign instead, how effective it can be. When they, instead of spending a lot of money, which of course it costs to do long-term lobbying, they spend it all on big news impact instead, and it worked very well. So that's just these things I've read in research.
I have a similar thought, Camilla, was what Nadine was, I mean, a little bit really from my past life and as a campaign manager, is that media coverage and is a great equalizer. We saw it as an equalizer because we were very proud that we were good at getting our campaigns into the media, and it was one of our superpowers. And we saw it as something, we don't pay money for advertising. Yeah, we get our issues on the agenda through media and journalism work. Now, it was quite a large charities that I used to work for, so we had lobbying teams as well as press officers, and it was very coordinated, and it was to have that impact, and things were timed, and we thought about it very, very carefully. So certainly there was a time where one of the great equalizers, I think you teach people, you don't have money, you can't give politicians donations, you don't have these other advantages, but if you are clever and you are creative and you understand the media, that is an equalizer. You can compete almost equally with richer organizations. I don't know how much has changed recently. People say that the journalistic media is less influential, maybe by degrees. Everybody wants to have an online mobilization campaign now, don't they? Everybody wants to be on social media, and organizations get a lot of data from that, and they feel it can work for them. I would say media, the ability to get your campaign into journalistic media is still important, I would say. Do you think so, Nadine? I mean, after your research?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's crucial. I mean, I'm also on the board of a Brussels-based NGO, and they are constantly trying to get into the media with their kind of statements on certain issues. So I do think it's still important to gain legitimacy to some extent. It's just sometimes so hard because to analyze these things, because you don't really have oftentimes access to what the NGO is doing behind the scenes. So this was really like a good opportunity to do this analysis.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And it's another important dimension. Yeah. And so, and I don't know, the good lobby is part of your training on media relations work, but yeah, it is certainly important still. Yeah.
It is, and I'll be super brief because I'm conscious of time, but I would just, it comes down also to doing your homework, and the point in the policy process, you have to think about when your influence is the most needed. So for instance, if you're if the draft directive has already gone through the commission and you're having a huge media blast, but it's already gone through parliament, it's going to be a little bit tougher. You have to really know what's coming down the pipeline, which comes from having a good monitoring, and really create your media noise before, like during the drafting process, not when the draft is already released, which tends to be when people make the biggest, I would say, outcry, because that's when it's public, but by then it's already almost too late. So I think media can be super influential, but it's another moment where you want to do it while they're in the drafting period, because it's in the revision period, you're already a little bit too late and you're waiting for the next revision to be approved.
Yeah, that's true. I also, between friends, I know communication studies, many colleagues are very interested in protest movements and things, and I just want to whisper sometimes, yeah, but if you're protesting, you're losing, that it shouldn't be the center of what's interesting. It should be getting and influencing earlier, influence the draft, influence the proposal, don't be protesting against the proposal. Anyway, I do like an unpopular opinion sometimes. I don't mind. It's quite fun. But I think we're coming to the end. We should keep good time. And I just want to see if anybody has any questions here urgently you would like to ask or would like to participate in. Thank you, Gabrielle, for that comment. In the Q&A, Gear asks, can you have a new word to change for lobbying? I don't know. If you have any good suggestions, please share them. We put them on a T-shirt and ask people to hug us and things.
No, I think you might as well just stick to it, because, you know, in some ways it's less transparent to change. If you're doing the same tactics with a new word, it looks even shadier. I think you might as well say we're lobbying, good lobbyists, bad lobbyists, but be a lobbyist, because if you just reinvent the term and do the same thing, it just makes you look like you're a snake shedding its skin or something.
Yeah, we can change the meaning of words, can't we? It's absolutely. Thank you. Should we come to an end? Camilla, Anna nodded. Yeah, let's just come to an end. I want to say thank you to Kelsey for being a guest, really great guest, and the conversation's really started to get going, and we could talk for longer, I know, but this is perfect. We should finish now. Thank you to everybody who's come along and the contributions, particularly Anna and Camilla. Thank you to Angeles and the EUPRERA team for facilitating this. And it's a really nice thing to do, webinars. We should do more in the future.